I believe between now and 2030, the world is going to be facing economic collapse. And even the strongest free market advocate, when they're affected, they're going to rush towards socialism. If this economy doesn't hold together, if Donald Trump loses this race, God help us all, because you're going to have somebody like Elizabeth Warren, and she is going to use the motherly, we just need to take care of each other kind of thing, and we will end the free market. It's part of her plan. So it's important that we all know what is right and why it's right. Now, recessions can be prevented. They can be lessened. With 0% interest loans, they can flood the market with cheap money. It doesn't usually help the lower class, and middle class doesn't really get rich. It actually expands the distance between the poor and the wealthy. But financial mishaps can be prevented with government bailouts. That's what we did in 2008. Poor investments can be prevented with economic district planned, by appointed committees. Financial cycles can be prevented completely, now listen to this, by way of the modern monetary theory, MMT. And this is a new theory. It's not. It's a very old theory, and it does not work. It's magic. We'll get into this later on this week, but it is where governments simply print money they need at any time they determine they need it, and any level of money. It's Zimbabwe, it is Venezuela, and it will end our way of life. And you have people in Washington now discussing it as a brilliant new idea. So you can do a lot of things, but what tends to occur when governments and central banks interfere with financial markets is they make the recession much worse. So the next recession, becomes a depression. It wouldn't have happened that way if you would have let it just go and people pay for the mistakes that they made. It creates a distortion in our financial market by injecting policies and currency and false demand where it would not have otherwise been. It makes it impossible. The deleveraging process doesn't happen. It doesn't flush the bad business ideas and investments out of the system and make room for new, better ideas. The banks never had to pay for their mistakes, and they are much worse today, even with all the new regulation, than they were before 2008. Now, I want to show you the worst example of a centrally planned and controlled economy and how it makes things worse. It's China. Yesterday, I told you that their debt to GDP is running at 87% to GDP. What? We're running at about 68% of GDP, which means take 68% of everything that we have made and sold and purchased for the year. Take 68% of that and just add that to our debt. They're at negative 487%. They are centrally planned. They have 13 special economic zones. Each one has a committee to determine what to build, what investments to make, what resources to mine. And for years, pundits, the media, people in banking, they all talk about the Chinese miracle, an unprecedented 22 years in a row of GDP growth. At least on paper. This is why they have ghost cities, entire gigantic cities with no one living in them. According to Merrill Lynch, more than 50% of the companies in China are actually bankrupt. 50%. They are zombie companies. They're kept alive not because they're able to produce a profit or pay debts, but because their debts are continually refinanced by the central bank in a never-ending cycle of more debt to cover the bad investments. It's the very definition of good money after bad. This is why, as I told you yesterday, they had to create $50 trillion in new currency since 2014. $50 trillion. So you know all the currency in print from all over the world today is $60 trillion. So they printed almost what every country in the world has in currency. And half of that went into these zombie companies. Wow. Now, what happens when bad companies and poor investments aren't allowed to fail for political reasons? Well, one analogy is think of forest fires. Think of forest fire. We have this knee-jerk reaction when a forest fire occurs. Oh, no, there's a fire. Something's gone wrong. We've got to put it out. We got to save the forests. Well, no, now wait a minute. Hold it just a second. The forest will grow back. It will grow back. It is natural. Now, if somebody is doing arson, that's different. But lightning is natural. We have more forest now than we've ever had. Because why? We don't let them burn like it happened in nature. And we also plant an awful lot of trees. We all know that it's settled science that fires are a very important part of the ecological cycle. It helps keep the forest healthy. It also removes the older, unhealthy, and dead plants and converts them into a nutritional resource for the soil, and it allows a much healthier forest to grow. Our continued intervention into that natural cycle of forest fire prevents the dead underbrush and the fallen trees from being removed. This is why California has fire after fire after fire. The fire, when you do that, the fire just rolls through. It becomes an out-of-control firestorm that destroys the entire forest and not just the dead and unhealthy underbrush. The credit cycle is the same. It is the natural way for self-organizing markets to ensure that resources are allocated to the healthiest and most productive ideas, products, and companies. And when they go out of business, when people learn their lesson and they pay the price for bad decisions, it's painful, just like a forest fire is, but it adds nutrients to the soil of the free market. So it's good for economies. However, if you interfere, it's very bad. A little spot fire pops up in the economy. We extinguish it with mountains of zero interest loans, bailouts from government investments. We are making it much, much worse. Our economy is strewn now with overgrown companies and programs that simply grow the bubble even bigger. It's happening in the banking sector. Which brings us to presidents. It is understandable that politicians do not like recessions. I don't want a recession, and I'm telling you, if the economy goes to hell in a handbasket, which many people are rooting for, it means the president loses this. And if he loses this race, we become a planned society without a free market. During recessions, everybody's looking for somebody to blame because we think recessions are not natural, that they're bad. The president, the most visible politician, he has the most authority. And so he gets an, outsized share of the blame when, quote, something goes wrong. And if you look at the presidency since World War II, every one-term president had their first term marred by a recession. Ford, Carter, Bush won. Ford probably was doomed anyway because of Nixon, but the trend holds. Before World War II, recessions also took their toll with, with 4 one-term presidents suffering through a recession or depression during the first term. 2 others were assassinated. And FDR did break the mold, but he was, he elongated, I think, the worst economy in U.S. history. And he sold the people a line of lies that were just that. They were lies. They were not helping anyone. They were elongating things. And he did it out of compassion, which can be misplaced. Trump, however, I think is the most acute case of recession impacting reelection chances that we've ever seen, because he has built his presidency on the economy. He has taken credit for everything. So stocks are up, unemployment low, GDP growth been solid every quarter, top line metrics look good. He talks about it. He says, see, what we're doing is good. It makes him vulnerable to a downturn, very vulnerable, especially in this where the media and everybody else is just not telling you the truth. He knows this. And he's going to be keenly focused on the economy, make sure it doesn't slip into recession, I think at all costs. He and his team are already advocating a Fed cut for interest rates, restart the quantitative easing by just buying distressed assets like farmers that are losing their farms. And we should expect more of that over the next few months. Now, here's some good news. Everybody in the Fed, they look at themselves like heroes. They are Jesus, Neo from the Matrix, and Ben Bernanke, all rolled up into one. They didn't learn anything from this. They think what they did was save the economy, and in some ways they were right. The Federal Reserve did reload after the bailouts of 2009. Central banks around the world did not. But we raised our interest rates off the 0% level. We got them up to 2.5, and we sold a lot of that bad debt until recently. Every time we sold it, the market crashed 20%, first in January, then in April, then October to Christmas. And since then, they haven't deleveraged anything, but they do have some ammo to stave off a recession, at least for a while. But it will make the next one worse. Now, here's what we can do. We can prepare ourselves and our families, our businesses, and our communities. We can keep what we have in safe places. We can make sure that we have savings. And it may mean that you sacrifice, something you want today so you have something when it's raining outside. You can pay off the debt where you can. You can refinance right now into a lower interest rate. Get those credit card debt. Get it down. Get your interest rate on the credit cards from 18% to 4% if you can. Cut back on all unnecessary expenses. And I know this sounds stupid, but I think one of the reasons why we suffer so much today is because we have broken our covenant as a covenant nation every single day. We have chased God out of our schools, out of our churches, many of them. We don't have any rules anymore. We don't believe in truth anymore. And we were a covenant nation. We have to start living the covenant. We have to start behaving like God's people, which means we have to start serving each other more. We have to start being decent more. We have to restrain the natural man in us. And the biggest part of that is getting down on our knees, humbling ourselves, asking for forgiveness, and praying for our country. Praying that what his will is done. Whether we like it or not, whatever he deems is best for us, that it's done and we accept it, and that our hearts are softened so we can help one another through whatever comes.